We've been in this series for a while now, and those of you that maybe you're hanging out first time with us, I just want to welcome you and say thanks for being here, and really glad you're hanging out. You're coming kind of in the middle of a conversation that we've been having for a while around the person of Jesus and who he is and what it is that exactly he's inviting us to participate in. We've been walking through the book of Matthew, and we've been talking about a reality that Jesus is letting us see through his gospel in Matthew. The fact that God's desire for us is that it would be on earth as it is in heaven. That's why we've called this series that. And we've been looking at a lot of things that have hopefully, and as I've talked to people, I think there's a lot of information, a lot of learning, there's a lot of new ideas around who Jesus is that I think have kind of changed some of our thinking. And as I've talked to different people, it seems like a number have come to me and said, hey, I've never really thought about Jesus that way. I never saw this that way. Or, this is opening up new ways of understanding how I live my faith out. We've really been emphasizing a few major points in this series. We've been talking a lot about how God truly has gone through incredible efforts to not only make himself known to us, but also that God lives in close proximity to us. And so it's not just an issue of knowing God, but it's actually knowing him in a very personal, relational way. And we've talked about how God has made himself known in that aspect. And we've also looked at, very specifically, we've looked at how God meets regular human beings. The Sermon on the Mount that Jesus preached to a group of people gathered on a hillside begins with him talking to a group of individuals who were living in the mess of life. They were individuals who were at the end of their rope. They were people who found themselves caught in between in culture. And Jesus very clearly communicates to them that he is available, that God comes to them in the middle of the mess, in the middle of whatever it is that's happening in their life. And then last week we began to shift directions a little bit. And we've been talking a lot about Jesus and who he is. And then last week we started to see that in this discourse that Jesus was giving on this hillside to this group of people, he moves from talking about him or revealing himself to them to starting to discuss who they are and what their life is like. And if you were here last week, I think you probably walked away challenged, and I hope you did, challenged by this idea that Jesus and what he says about us, the fact that he defines human beings who follow him as salt that preserves a disintegrating world and light that illuminates a very dark world, that the fact that he sees us through that perspective should have some sort of life-altering impact on us, that we should look at our lives and our coming and our going and the places that we work and the places that we live and the friendships that we find ourselves in, that we should look at those things through a framework unlike anything we've ever understood before. That we see our lives as those lives being expressed in those places for God's purposes. Like he actually has us there for a reason, which means our lives actually matter. Our lives have far more significance than I think we often consider on our own. As we begin to shift the conversation that direction, there's something I think that starts to happen inside of me that maybe this is you, maybe you experience the same thing. But when I start to realize that my life matters, like when I go beyond just like this is great information about Jesus, and this is really cool that he meets me where I am. But when I start to see and I start to acknowledge the truth that the gospel actually compels me and pulls me into this purpose that God has for me, there's this question that starts rising up inside of me. I start wondering, well, is there anything that I should change? Is there anything that I should be doing differently? Like if I have this responsibility on my shoulders, if there's something that I'm supposed to be doing, are there things about my life that should be altered? Are there habits? Are there patterns of behavior? Are there things that I should be doing and things I should stop doing? Like those are the kind of questions that rise up in me. And that's a very natural thing to have happen. How many of you remember getting like your first like real job? You got your first real job? You remember this experience? Yeah. And probably if you're like me, when you got your first real job, one of the first things you did after you wore, like if you're a guy, you wore your one tie to the interview. After you got the job, if it was a tie-wearing place, you went and bought a couple more ties, right? Because when you realize like you've got a new job, when you land that new position, whatever it is, one of the first things that all of us do is we read the culture, right? We look around and we say, well, is there something that's expected of me now that I'm showing up at this new place of employment? Are there things that I should be doing, things that I shouldn't be doing? Are there things that I should wear and things that I shouldn't be wearing? These are, by the way, are very natural questions that you should ask. Some of you, the fact that you ended up in the human resources office wherever you work is evidence that maybe you should ask these questions. Like sometimes you just got to go, what's normal here? what's culturally acceptable here. But what happens to all of us very naturally is that when you and I start anything new, when responsibility is put on us, we immediately start thinking in regard to that responsibility, is there something that I should change? Is there something I should do? Is there a way that I should behave? That question is a natural question for us to ask. How am I behaving? It's not just something we do in the work arena, but it's also something we do in regard to our faith. This is a question that's always coming up. And I think it's one of those that as we talk about this series and as we address some of the barriers to faith and as we talk about things that oftentimes restrict people's ability to believe in Jesus, I think it's really important that we come to issues like this and we acknowledge that this is a very real question. All the time, like people say, well, if I believe in Jesus, am I permitted to do this? Or am I allowed to do that? Or what are the things I have to give up? I mean, those are questions we ask because we understand there's responsibility. As natural as that question is, as much as that's a very normal thing for us to ask, there's a side effect to this. There's a gravitational pull in one of two directions anytime we start asking questions about behavior, and specifically behavior around faith. And some of these questions can be answered, and maybe you draw a line here between these two different gravitational pulls, and maybe it's a line that's drawn by age or experience, but really the two poles that we get drawn to are one of these two. Oftentimes, when we start asking questions about behavior as a Christ follower, there's this gravitational pull towards religiosity. There's a gravitational pull that brings us, that draws us to a place where we start thinking about whether or not there are certain rules or regulations that we ought to be following. That is a very natural response for people, especially people of certain generations or people that grew up around the church, is when we start feeling this like, man, you're right, my life matters. We start thinking, well, if my life matters, should I be cleaning myself up a little, right? Is there stuff I should be stop doing? Is there stuff we have this pull to those things. We start making rules. We start making regulations. We start thinking about the hoops that we jump through. One of the reasons or one of the evidences of this, and we know this is true, is because if you go to anybody who isn't a part of church, and maybe some of you, you're just dropping in, you're just checking this thing out, maybe you could answer this for us, but if you go to people who are outside the church and you've got friends that are like this and you say, hey, what's our reputation as Christians? What are we known for? A lot of the time. Judgment, right? Rules, regulations, right? We're known as you can't do this, you can do that. That's one of the things that we're known for. And so a lot of people, their barrier to faith is even this idea that we have this tendency to draw ourselves towards regulations, towards religiosity, towards rules, towards lists of do's and don'ts. That's one of the places that we find ourselves being pulled to. Now, what's fascinating is that this day and age, more and more this is happening, and as our culture shifts and as America changes, and you've experienced this, some of you've watched this happen, there is another gravitational pull, and it's actually in the opposite direction. And we are individuals, as human beings, we are people who are drawn to one of these two polar opposites. The other response, when we hear people talking about the legalism or the rules or the regulations of Christianity, there are other people who say, no way, man, have you not met Jesus? And they're way on this Woodstock 2015 camp over here, right? Where it's like, no, wait, hold on a second. Like it's not about rules and regulations. Jesus was never about rules and regulations. That's not what Jesus was, just all about love, man. He's all about us hanging out and just being together, just chill with the whole rules thing, right? That's the other response. That's the other way that people go. There's this one response where we respond legalistically with rules and we say, if I'm supposed to be this Christian who lives out this life, then I ought to obey these things. And this other person that says, no, it's not about that. As a Christian, you're not perfect. You're just forgiven. Put it on a bumper sticker and slap it on your car, right? You're just like everybody else. You just need to love and be you and chill and don't get all stressed out, right? Those are the two extremes that we have a tendency to go to. In fact, here's what's fascinating. Some of you know this, and I'll say this, I'll admit this. I waver between these two. The pendulum for me goes between these two. I can just tell you that on Sunday mornings when I wake up, man, I am way over here. Because it's church day, right? And I want to be good, right? And so I'm thinking don't screw up, man. Don't mess up your life. Because that's what rules are basically about, right? Rules in life are essentially there to keep us from screwing things up. Think about laws in our culture today. When you drove here tonight, you obeyed certain laws. How many of those laws were about something good that you were going to do for others? None of them, right? All of the laws you obeyed getting here tonight were about you not messing things up for others, right? Because left to our own devices, we mess things up. And so rules and regulations, they exist so that we don't mess things up. There are days when I wake up and out of my religiosity, I go, man, I just want to really work at being good. Check the boxes, work the angles, be the religious person. Then there are other days after maybe I've gotten tired of that for a while where I'm way at this other extreme. And I'm like, why do I waste my energy and my time? Jesus just seems so loving. Do I even need to worry about those things? And here's what's fascinating. I can experience those. You can experience those. And what's amazing is that in the Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus is describing this new life that he offers, he actually says things that seem to contradict both of those ends of the spectrum. Jesus says some things that seem to confront head-on the religiosity that many people are drawn to as they try to answer, what does it look like to live like a Christian? And simultaneously, he says things to the Woodstock crew that seem to confront the place that they're coming from. So it's incredibly important that we answer this and look at what Jesus is saying for the sake of our own lives, because if we just keep coming to our own conclusions, our lives will just simply ricochet from place to place, back and forth again as we try to sort through these things. Jesus said some very interesting things. In fact, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to start in verse 17 tonight. And I just want to give you a preview of what he says, because Jesus says some things that I think are they're very confusing in many ways. And I think we have to look at them and just acknowledge what they are so that we can be honest about answering them. Listen to some of the things. I'll just give you a preview. Some of the things that he's about to say that we're going to read. Jesus is actually, one of the first things we're going to look at tonight is that Jesus is actually going to tell us that our righteousness, like the righteous acts that we perform, like our righteousness, our individual lives, that our righteousness needs to exceed or go beyond the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Like Jesus is going to say, like, you think the scribes and Pharisees are really holy, righteous people, you need to go further than them. And then there's this other thing that we're going to look at tonight where Jesus takes some common situations, some common scenarios of brokenness in the world, some areas where there were rules and regulations that were established and very well known, things like murder and anger and sexuality. And Jesus is going to make this statement. He's going to say this. He's going to say, you've heard it said that, and he's going to lay out whatever that religious rule was that people had been given. And then he follows that up with him saying, but I say, and then he says something else that seems to elevate whatever it was he was referring to, as if Jesus is raising the bar on religiosity. And then the last verse that we're going to look at, verse 48, there's this moment when Jesus actually says to the people on the hillside that are listening to him in this sermon, he actually speaks to them and says that you need to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. All of these statements, all of these things Jesus says, and if we don't answer this, if we just dismiss these things, if we just listen to him and we go, well, I don't really know what he's saying, and we dismiss it, we actually gut the gospel of what it's all about. If we just say, I don't really understand, if we just assume that either Jesus was alluding to something that would allow us to have more license and more liberty than we ever imagined, or if he was just giving us more rules and we just don't even want to mess with it, if we just leave ourselves there and we don't dig deeply into this, we actually gut the gospel of its power. We gut the message of Jesus from the transformation that it actually has the potential to cause in our lives. What is Jesus saying about our lives? Now that he's communicated to us that he's near to us and that he has a reason for us being here, that there's a purpose that we find in him, how do we actually live this life out? Let's read this together. Verse 17, he says this. He says, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota and not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now that last phrase, we know from this series that we've been talking about, entering the kingdom of heaven, is our participation in the spiritual dimension that Jesus is making known to us. It's a present tense reality that we can encounter. And he's saying in this moment, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter it. You'll never experience this life that I've been telling you all about. Because he says this, I think it's really important that we have a clear perspective of who the scribes and the Pharisees are. If the scribes and the Pharisees, if there was like an elite group, like a special forces of religiosity, that would be the scribes and the Pharisees. Like they are the Navy SEALs or the Delta Force of religion. That's who these guys are, right? Are you with me on this? You know what I'm saying? Like the scribes and the Pharisees are the individuals who wake up every day and they eat and they breathe and they sleep. Like they are all about rules and regulations. In fact, so many so that these individuals had an exorbitant amount of rules that they tried to obey every day. And I think this is a really interesting conversation because in our culture today, when somebody talks about the law, like Jesus is talking about the law and it passing away, when we think about the law and commandments in our culture today, what do we usually think back to? The Ten Commandments, right? We go back to the Ten Commandments, which, by the way, I love the Ten Commandments. I love them for lots of reasons. I'll talk about them in just a few minutes. I love it because God just gave us 10, right? Because I can do 10, right? God looked at us and he's like, I was going to give you guys a dozen, but you only had 10 fingers. And I figured you can only remember the number of fingers that you have, right? And so he gave us 10 commandments, and 10 commandments are pretty simple. In fact, the 10 commandments, when you really look at them closely, they are a beautiful picture of flourishing. They're a beautiful picture of humanity living together the way that God intended us to live together. You know, not murdering each other, and not taking each other's stuff, and not like taking each other's wives, and actually being people of worship, people of depth. Like the 10 commandments describe a life that is beautiful and wonderful and good. 10 things that we could do. The scribes and the Pharisees, this elite religious group, these individuals that Jesus says our righteousness should exceed, these individuals had 248 specific commandments that they had extrapolated from the 10 commandments that they were trying to obey every single day. Pretty nuts, right? They also had prohibitions. They had 365 prohibitions, like one for every day of the year, I guess. They were like, let's just have one a day. But 365 prohibitions that they also lumped to the 248 commandments. So if you do your math, that is 613 commandments or prohibitions that they were trying to live by every single day. It's like when a scribe or a Pharisee came home and like dropped the briefcase at the door, and the scribe wife looked at the scribe husband and said, "How was your day?" If he said good, it meant that maybe he hit like 575 of the 613 commandments for the day, right? Like, good job. You got like 80%. That was awesome. Like, you obeyed hundreds and hundreds of these commandments. Like, that was the expectation for them. Which should cause us to really consider what Jesus is saying when he looks and says, your righteousness needs to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. Like, doesn't that make you wonder, like, what is Jesus actually saying here? And here's what we know. The people who were on the hillside in Matthew chapter 5, the listeners at the Sermon on the Mount, these individuals, they knew who the scribes and the Pharisees were. Like, they knew them well. I mean, these were like the monks, the Navy SEALs. Like, they knew who this group was. And so as they listened to Jesus say this, not only did they know who that was, but they also knew that they weren't the scribes and Pharisees, right? I mean, they knew. Jesus had just got done explaining to them that they were the group of people who were unexpected to receive the blessing, this life, this kingdom come close to them. Like, Jesus had just spent time telling them that they weren't the likely ones, and they're very aware of the scribes and Pharisees. And so the question is, why would Jesus say this? Especially if he has just attracted them to the fact that they were unlikely and yet receiving his grace and mercy. Is this bait and switch? Is Jesus really all about religion? Is that what he's all about? It's all about the rules and regulations. So we have this tendency, and this is why Jesus does this. We have a tendency. We have a tendency when it comes to our lives to go from extremes of either religiosity or lawlessness. Jesus understands this about us. And so in this moment, these people, as Jesus is saying to them, you're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. You're blessed when you're persecuted for my name's sake. You're blessed. You have this life even though you didn't deserve it. When he says all these things to these people, Jesus understands that to a human heart, to a human understanding, what he's acknowledging or what they're acknowledging is that if they have this life, because they aren't Pharisees, because they failed the test of the law over and over again, it must mean that the law doesn't matter. You see what I'm saying? Like these individuals, the only way, like this life that Jesus is offering, this relationship with God and this life of blessing and this peace and this hope and this joy, the only way that these individuals ever knew they could achieve that was by obeying the religious rules, and they hadn't done it. And so when Jesus says, no, you have this life, well then the obvious conclusion to them is, well, if I have this life and I didn't obey the rules, then the rules must not matter, right? And so Jesus almost immediately confronts where their minds would have been going. Remember, this is a sermon. This is a message that Jesus is preaching to them. And so he addresses the very thing they were thinking, well, if that's true, the law doesn't matter. And Jesus says, oh, no, listen, I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill the law. Which means our understanding of the law may be very different as well. I want you to catch something and think through this with me, because I do think this transforms how we understand. I think oftentimes people go, wow, like how much attention do I pay to the law in the Bible? Like how critical is this? Let me just say this. So like if Jesus is good, and the people that are listening to him in this message, they've been experiencing him as he's been preaching and traveling the countryside, and they've been listening to his words, and they're discovering his goodness. And in the same way that we are here because we know, like deep down, there's something that resonates inside of us that says Jesus is good. If Jesus is good, and Jesus fulfills the law as he's stating here, then what does that mean about the law? If Jesus is good, and Jesus fulfills the law, it means that the law itself is good. The law is good. The law is a good thing. Just because those individuals had failed the test of the law doesn't mean that the law wasn't valid. Like when was the last time? Like think about this for us. I mean, think about if you're in school and you fail a test. Does that bring the validity of the test into question? Right? Like you get an F on a final and you go to your professor and you walk in and you say, hey, I'd like to dispute this because clearly there's something wrong with your test. I failed, right? It's invalid, right? Or like you get a review at work and it's a really bad review and you go into your boss and you say, hey, can we talk about our review process? There's something broken in it because I got a bad review. And it just seems like there's something wrong with the process if I got a bad review, right? It doesn't work that way, does it? Like if there's something that goes wrong with our process, it doesn't mean that whatever's testing us is invalidated, and that's the way that it works with God's law. Just because the people failed the test of God's law, just because we don't measure up to God's law, doesn't mean that God's law isn't good. In fact, Jesus goes as far as to say that greatness in the kingdom of heaven is actually directly associated with our love for and our proclamation of the law. The law is good. The law is beautiful. In fact, the law of God, as I was mentioning the 10 Commandments a couple of moments ago, the 10 Commandments themselves, they were this expression of human flourishing. The law of God is an expression of what God desires for us as he looks at a humanity that's broken, that wounds one another, that speaks ill of one another, that murders one another, that steals from one another. As God looks at humanity that abuses and leverages for our own good, the law of God is actually an expression of God's hope for us. In fact, the law of God is actually attributed to God's heart. Like the law of God is representative of his heart, his goodness, his wholeness, what he wants for us. And so the law of God, it's not abolished with Jesus and these words. The law of God is actually being elevated. But here's what I also want you to catch. Not only is it being elevated, it's also being clarified. And I want you to just look at verse 20 again. If you've got a Bible or it's on your device or whatever, look at this verse because he says this again. He says, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." I just want to read that again because When we first read this, our assumption when we hear Jesus say this is, well, aren't you saying there's more rules then? Like if the law is good and you're telling us to exceed scribes and Pharisees, like aren't you saying that better adherence to rules is what this is about? But I want you to think of it differently. When Jesus says exceeds, we think of that word like exceeding the righteousness of scribes and Pharisees. We think of that on a linear plane. We think of that in terms of somebody doing something in one direction and we say, I'm going to do that, but now I'm going to take that to a new level. Like I'm going to keep doing what you're doing, but I'm going to do more of it and I'm going to do better of it. I'm going to exceed you in that. When you look deeper into what Jesus is saying, he's actually not referencing the idea of us exceeding in that capacity. He's actually speaking of us moving beyond the righteousness of scribes and Pharisees. So the way we might understand it is this. The righteousness of scribes and Pharisees is like an individual who comes into a field and approaches a tree line where there's a forest. And as they walk towards that, they stand at that tree line and they're experiencing the edge of that forest. They're experiencing things. They're making observations from this place of transition. And what Jesus is describing is that the Pharisees, they live in this place at the edge of the tree line. They live in this place at the edge of the forest. And when he speaks of moving beyond the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, he's not talking about continuing along the tree line. He's talking about moving deeper into those woods, moving deeper into this place where the experience is radically different, where it is no longer defined by what these individuals were experiencing out there. There's something completely different. Are you with me on this? He talks about moving beyond. You're not just standing in the same place. You're not just exceeding, doing more of the same. You're actually talking about something completely different. You're experiencing something completely other. So Jesus is simultaneously, he's elevating the law. He's saying, listen, the law matters far more than you ever imagined. Don't discard it. But at the same time, I want you to move beyond your understanding of it and what anyone has ever represented to you in it. So the scribes and the Pharisees, the tree line, the edge of the forest, they had taken the law and they had created these elaborate specifications of what it looked like to be obedient to the law. They said, well, if this is the law, then these are the behaviors that you should exhibit because of it. And so they put the rules and the regulations there. And they put this immense social pressure on the people that were around them to adhere to the rules and the regulations. They were pressuring people. They were forcing people to conform to the rules. They're individuals who become intensely self-focused, individuals who are self-conscious about whether or not they're always doing the right thing or not doing the right thing, and they're incredibly self-conscious about what others are thinking about them and their perception of their goodness or their rightness. And there are also individuals who experienced zero transformation of the heart. With all of their rules and all of their regulations, the dimensions of their character, the dimensions of their heart were untouched. They were unchanged. They stood at the edge of the woods and they never stepped in, and their lives were never transformed. And here's what Jesus knows, that all of us, we can agree with this. We know this. The heart, the human heart, trumps the intellect eventually, doesn't it? Like the human heart, our emotions, where our heart is, our heart, no matter where it is and what it is, eventually it will triumph over whatever discipline we've set in front of ourselves, whatever we've determined ourselves to do, whatever thing it is we've said we want it to be through the will. Eventually the heart overcomes it, right? Eventually, like you can only obey the rules for so long. You can only follow the regulations for a certain period of time. And eventually, whatever exists in your heart will override the rule obeying. It'll override whatever it is that you're trying to discipline yourself toward. Because rules don't change anything. Rules don't actually transform our heart. They don't actually change our lives. Regulations don't transform the texture of the human heart. It's impossible for rules to do that. And what we discover and what Jesus is revealing to us in this moment, and this is where things begin to make sense, is that there's a difference between the rules of the Pharisees and the law of God. They're two completely different things. The rules and the laws, the rules and the law itself is not the same. That's why Jesus does what he does next. In this sermon, I want you to understand that he moves on and he starts to talk about these 6 very specific situations that exist in culture, 6 examples of human brokenness. And he highlights each one of these. And we're going to talk about these in the weeks to come and kind of dive into some of these as we move through this series. But in verse 21, he starts to talk about these issues. And essentially what he does is he says, this is the religiosity of the Pharisees, and this is what I'm talking about. This is what it looks like to exceed the religiosity of the Pharisees. And in verse 21, he talks about anger. And then in verse 27, he talks about sexuality. And then in verse 31, he talks about marriage. And then in verse 33, he talks about oaths and our integrity. And then in 38, he talks about retaliation. And then in verse 43, he starts to talk about one of the toughest issues that we'll actually end with tonight, and that's loving our enemies. And in every one of these situations, he takes anger and sex and marriage and integrity and retaliation and loving enemies, and he says, here's the standard that you were given over here in like religious world. Here's what the rules were previously. Here's what you heard it said you should do or could do, what was permissible. But I say, and then he says something that seems to completely change the subject, like elevate it from where it was to a completely different place, and in many cases cause us to say, wow, are you just being more religious, or is there something else here? And I think we see there's something else. Look at verse 21. We'll look at the first one, then we'll look at the last one. He says this. He says, you've heard that it was said to those of old that you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, some of your translations use the word raka, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Was Jesus making this more difficult? Think about this in light of what he's been saying. If this is beyond the scribes and Pharisees, then what is he revealing to us? What he's showing us. And in this first one, you see this principle, and this principle applies to every one of these 6 scenarios that Jesus uses as an illustration. What he shows us, what he's revealing to us, is that Jesus moves from the activity, from the action, from the behaviors of religion to the heart of what drives a human being. It's not the murder that needs to change. It's the heart that needs to change. This phrase, this idea of raka, it's interesting. It's an Aramaic word that got transliterated directly over. And raka, this word raka, you say it like this. You say raka like that. Just say it with me, everyone. Just ready? Raka, right? Come on, do it again. Really loud, like raka, right? See how you kind of get a little phlegm in the back of your throat when you do that? You know how he's like raka. If you say it right, there's a little bit of like you're going to spit. That's actually where the word comes from. The word actually, its origin is this noise that you feel when you're going to spit or spew something out, like when you're going to hock a loogie, for lack of a better term. Like when you're going to do that, there's this guttural thing that happens. That's the origin of that word. What Jesus is saying is murder isn't the issue. The issue is this contempt that you feel for another person. You don't murder people unless you hate people. You don't murder people unless you disregard people, unless you have contempt for people, unless you think that you're more important than other people. And so Jesus is acknowledging the heart of the issue is this attitude of contempt that you have towards others. The issue is not the murder. The issue is that you would ever have it in you to disregard another human being this way. This idea, this principle is what runs through all of these. Every one of these moments where Jesus says, you've heard it said, but I say, every one of these is characterized by this. In every situation, Jesus acknowledges that you and I have the ability to exploit other individuals for our own good or for our own needs or to get what we want. That's what he's revealing. These things happen. These social ills, these struggles of humanity occur because we at our base elevate ourselves over other individuals. We treat others like raka. We treat them with contempt. And because of that, the culture around us breaks down. Jesus says there's something else that has to happen. It's not the behaviors, it's the heart. Something needs to change. The final one of these is I think, particularly challenging and confrontational. The last one, Jesus talks about loving our enemies. And in verse 43, he says this. He says, you've heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be, listen to this, sons of your Father who's in heaven. So Jesus says, listen, there's a different way, and I want you to behave. I want you to participate as one who is living out the kingdom. I want your life to reflect your Father who's in heaven. I want people to see you and say, aren't you so-and-so's son? Aren't you so-and-so's daughter? Because there's a reflection of your Father in heaven. Jesus says that, and then look at how he describes our Father in heaven. He says, for he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. And he sends rain on the just and on the unjust. See, he's bipartisan. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? And then in verse 48, he says, you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. This sounds as if Jesus is laying like the final religious trump card, right? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Be perfect. Be perfect. What does he mean by be perfect? Is this more rules? Of course it isn't, right? This statement about perfection is a statement that's being made in the context of our Heavenly Father expressing his agape, his unconditional love towards humanity. In fact, we know in other places in Scripture, right? We know that God is what? God is love, right? God is love. God is perfect. God expresses this very perfect, this very whole, this beautiful agape, unconditional love for humanity. Unconditional love that says, I love you regardless of whether or not you've done what I want you to do. I love you regardless of whether or not you've behaved the way I want you to behave. I love you. He sends rain on the good and the evil. The sun rises and sets on them both, right? He's completely unconditional. And Jesus is saying, listen, in the same way that you've experienced that, like you yourself have experienced this unconditional love, in the same way that you've experienced this agape, you now live this out. You live this as your Heavenly Father has lived this towards you. As it's been extended to you, you now extend it to others. You receive agape and you extend agape to the people that are around you. That's what Jesus is saying. Now, how does this happen? How do we actually become these people? And I think there is this challenging part of it, right? We go, well, how am I supposed to do that? Like, how am I supposed to love like God loves? Like, still, like Jesus, it seems like you're setting an insurmountable objective that we cannot overcome, right? Like we can't accomplish this in our lives. And the beautiful thing is, if you go right back to the beginning, Jesus said something remarkable. The law is good, and the law is beautiful, and God's love is perfect. But Jesus said, I haven't come to abolish the law. I've come to fulfill the law. And what Jesus is saying is, listen, if you want this, if you desire this, I'm the fulfillment of the law. You look to me. I am where you find this. I'm the fulfillment. You're not the fulfillment of the law. I'm the fulfillment of the law. Not only am I the fulfillment of the law, but I am the visible, living expression of God's love. I am the most visible example of what God has done for you in your desperation. There is a relationship between our intimacy with God and our behavior. There is a relationship between intimacy with God and behavior, but it isn't the way that we think it is. Our behavior and intimacy are related, but only as we experience intimacy with God do we experience genuine transformation in our life. Only as we encounter Jesus as he is, do we actually experience transformation and then have our behavior, what we do and where we go and how we talk and where we spend our time. Only then are those things transformed. We don't shape our intimacy with God by how we behave. This summer, when I was on my sabbatical, I've told a couple of stories, and I'll tell you this one, that I had gone off by myself for a few days into the woods, and I was just spending some time really just focusing on my relationship with God, just reminding myself of these things. In fact, these are passages that I found myself just reading over and over and over again, being reminded of God's love for me, being reminded of God's care of me, being reminded of what Jesus has done for me. And day after day, I would spend time and I would read in the morning and I would journal, and I'd write some things down. And after a few days of this, I suddenly started having this... these like moments when I wanted to define what it was I was feeling, because something was happening like inside of me, like something was changing. I was feeling energized. I was feeling joy. I was feeling things that I hadn't felt for a while. And so at the end of my time in the morning when I was journaling, the bottom of each page, I would write a single word that just kind of encapsulated what it was I was feeling. And so I did that like the first day, and I did that the second day, and then I kind of did that day after day. I kept writing these words. And then... after several days, one morning I sat down, and for some reason I just thought, I want to see all the words. I just was kind of thinking about all this stuff that I just feel like God's been working in my life. And so I turned to this blank page and I started looking back, and I was looking at the words, and I'd write one, and then I'd go to the next page and I'd write another one, and I'd look back and I'd write the next one. I just kind of kept doing that. And as I was finishing up those words, I looked at all of them on the page, and I suddenly realized that the words that I had been writing down were the fruit of the Spirit that Paul describes in the book of Galatians. And suddenly I realized that the fruit of the Spirit is something that those of you that have been around church, you know what they are: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, self-control. I think I missed one in there, but those have always been a discipline for me. It's always been, I'm going to try hard to be patient, and I'm going to try hard to be kind, and I'm going to try hard to be gentle. They were always disciplines, like that's what I'm supposed to be. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, I realized, no, wait a second. The more intimate that I become with Jesus, the closer I become to Him, the more I acknowledge what He's done for me, suddenly there's this thing that just comes out of me, like something is changing, which is maybe why the Apostle Paul calls them fruit, because you can't manipulate their production, right? Something has to happen at the core. Something has to happen that's healthy. That's what Jesus is describing. We aren't earning this, and we aren't deserving this, but we are reflecting the love that we've received, and we are carrying out the mission and the calling of Jesus in our lives. Because of what has been done for us, we are different. And I want to be really clear. Are we better people? Like, do we become better people? Do we change? Like, all of this, everything we're talking about, the answer to that is yes. We do change. We don't change because we've been religious, and we don't change because we've thrown out the law. We change because we're being transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the gospel, as we look at Jesus, as we acknowledge what He's done for us, when we agree with our brokenness and we accept the love and the grace that God extends to us, when we see Him clearly, there is something that happens inside of us, and we become better people to live with. We become less angry. We become less jealous. We become more joyful. We become more peaceful. There is transformation that takes place because we have intimacy with God, because we've seen His agape love. We've experienced it. Because we know Him. There's change. Jesus wants transformed people. I want to be really clear about that. As He talks about this idea of it being on earth as it is in heaven, one of the most significant aspects of that is individuals like you and I who experience transformation. Jesus wants transformation, but He wants it in the right way. He wants it to come from the right place, and He wants it for the right reasons. Does this make sense? Would you pray with me? Lord, I just think that so many of us in the room, we kind of swing, the pendulum swings back and forth, and we wonder, how do we do this? How do I live this out? Am I religious, or is this all about freedom? And does it really matter what I do? And what You've called us to is something deeper. You're beckoning us into the woods. You're calling us into something that is more robust and more profound and more transforming than any rules could ever be. And I just pray for all of us in the room tonight that as we grapple with this, as we wrestle with these strange moments, when You say things that seem to kind of create a stir, I pray that that you would open our eyes and that the stir that is created would be one that draws us closer to yourself, that we would love you more, that we would know you more, and that we would experience this sort of gospel transformation that you desire for us. We love you, Jesus, and we pray this in your name.